Welcome to Energy Unplugged, the go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. My name is Dan Monzani. I'm Aurora's Managing Director for UK, Ireland and India. One of the common themes in the energy debate in both the UK and India is a renaissance of interest in nuclear power, in part because of the rising demand for clean, reliable power from the global technology sector. I'm fortunate to have two guests with deep expertise in the role of nuclear power in decarbonisation and the needs of the telecommunications sector. My first guest today is Kirsty Gogan. Kirsty is the founder and managing partner of Terra Praxis and also managing partner of LucidCatalyst. She specialises in large-scale market-based decarbonisation, particularly looking at how innovation can help nuclear power to play a major role. Kirsty's been a member of the UK government's Nuclear Innovation Research and Advisory Board and co-founded Energy for Humanity, an environmental NGO. Welcome, Kirsty.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be here.
I'm also joined by Sir Alex Chisholm. Alex is Chair of EDF Energy, who own and operate all of the existing nuclear plants in the UK and are developing Hinkley Point C, the first new nuclear power station in the UK for a generation. Alex is also non-executive director at BT Group, the UK's leading fixed and mobile communications provider. Prior to this, Alex held a number of senior public policy roles as the chief executive of the Competition and Markets Authority, permanent secretary at the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and UK Chief Operating Officer. Alex, a warm welcome to Energy Unplugged.
Hi, Dan. Great to be with you.
So, Alex, the role of nuclear in supporting data center demand, you obviously got experience across both information technology and energy, so I think you're well placed to start here. We've had a lot of eye-catching news flow from the US about the role of large-scale nuclear in supporting technology. Microsoft reopening 3 Mile Island struck me as the most interesting. Why is it that nuclear is most suited to fulfilling this demand?
Great. I think there's two factors that are really weighing there. First of all, I think that events in Ukraine really focus people's attention on energy security, having sources of energy themselves that they could rely on within their own countries, homegrown, if you like. So that I think is one important driver. And secondly, after years in which actually we've been using less electricity due to more efficient technologies and conservation efforts, we're now seeing more of an increase in demand, not just from the transport sector and heating and industrial uses, but also, as you mentioned, from the tech sector. I think what's really interesting about the shape of the new demand is it really works at both edges. So half of it is actually coming in the sector where it can be used flexibly. So people, for example, might choose to charge their electric vehicle at night when there isn't as much of a usage for electricity. But some of it's actually very inflexible. And the data centers, what they need is super reliable, always on electricity, working 24/7 throughout the year, and with very high levels of reliability. So nuclear is actually a very good solution to those needs. And of course, it is something which you can have, you can put in a number of different sites. And particularly, I think, for the new AI-driven data centers, they're very, very focused on that super reliability, that very demanding of energy. They use about 10 times as much as more conventional kind of dense data centers, but they're less dependent on being near to large population centers. So the power source is critical for them.
Let's unpack a bit about those data centers. I mean, Aurora did a piece of work looking at the range of possible growth scenarios, and we put that range in the UK having between 1% and 5% of global data center capacity, and that equates to 2.7 to 7.4 gigawatts in energy terms. So quite substantial, but also still quite a substantial range. Is that the kind of range you see as the potential size of the prize for the UK? And how important would that be for UK macroeconomic growth if we were to pull off the upper end of that range?
Well, first of all, I think that AI is very important for the whole economy. There's not a sector that's not going to be changed by it. So obviously, all of us living in the UK want to see future prosperity and growth, and AI is going to be an important part of that. As you say, exactly how much energy will be demanded by AI data centers depends not only on the data centers themselves and how their future profile of energy consumption changes. Generally, you'd expect them to get more efficient over time. That happens with most things. But also how much of the market that we capture in the UK. As you say, I think, your forecast and actually also the NESO forecast put a terrific range there between, I think, 16 and 62 terawatt hours of electricity in 2050. Now, And everyone thinks in terms of terawatt hours. So one way of thinking about it, it's about the same as the entire commercial sector last year. So that's a huge amount of electricity, just the data centers. But then the economy is becoming very digital. So, the whole economy is relying on those data centers, and also people are in their day-to-day lives. We're all dependent on cloud-based services in our lives, and that's true for business as well.
How well placed is the UK though versus other countries? I mean, I think we've looked at this in a number of places, and it's quite tempting for every market to believe that their country will be the one that the data centers come to. Do you think the UK's well placed?
I think the UK has got a lot of things going for it. First of all, it's got a government that is very focused on this and trying to provide a lot of support to it, active support. It's got a very well established and I think generally well regarded regulatory system. There have been issues around planning and grid connections, but as you've seen from the government's announced plans, they're really focused on that. It's actually been a good market for data as a whole, because UK consumers are quick to take up new applications. We like new technology. We're very accepting of it, and we've been very welcoming of the big international hyperscalers and all their efforts here. So I think all that is in favour of the UK as a location. If energy was the only consideration, then obviously you'd be looking at other parts of the world. But one of the things that I found from our dealings at EDF with the big tech companies is they're thinking very long term about their support from their customer base, their mandate. They don't want to be putting heavy energy load, which comes at the expense of other users of energy, and they also really have to think about the long-term sustainability of that. And so nuclear, of course, which actually is the best source of low carbon energy, and it actually over the total life scale has less CO2 emissions than any other source, and that's UN information, not just if you like EDF information. Really has a big part to play there. Plus the extraordinary energy density. We're a small, crowded island, relatively speaking, and you can provide enough electricity for 6 million households in a quarter of a square mile, which is what we're doing at Hinkley.
Kirsty, let me bring you in here. I mean, Alex touched on it a little bit. I think it's fairly uncontroversial to say that if we want to get anywhere near the kind of nuclear renaissance that people would like to see, at least in Europe and the US, then we're going to need to be able to accelerate deployment. I know you've been working with the World Economic Forum on the framework for accelerating advanced nuclear and small modular reactors, but you'll also have views, I'm sure, on what the UK government's done recently. So what are the headlines of your work with the World Economic Forum, and what needs to change to make that step change in deployment of nuclear?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And just to sort of double click on what Alex was saying there about the sort of the power density of nuclear. Data centers are the most power dense facilities on the planet, and so really, the scale of the data centers that we're going to need in future to power AI will be, quite large in the gigawatts plural scale. So having an incredibly power dense and clean and reliable and ideally affordable source of power for those data centers is going to be really fundamental. But of course, global technology companies are not the only demand drivers here. You've got more than 30 countries now have pledged to triple nuclear capacity by 2050. By the way, achieving that target would require construction rates of around 30 gigawatts per year, each year for 20 years, starting in 2030. So that's actually kind of an incredible undertaking for the sort of large scale conventional industry to be thinking about. And then beyond that, you've got industrial energy users, including, of course, those global tech companies, signaling demand for hundreds of gigawatts of reliable and clean power. So it's this sort of context that has informed the work that we've been doing with the World Economic Forum, recognizing that throughout the network of members in the WEF, there are companies, refinery companies, oil and gas companies, steel, chemical, aluminium plants that have all set targets for decarbonizing their operations. And many of these companies are beginning to signal that nuclear energy may be the most practical option to co-locate small modular reactors with those facilities to supply heat or power or steam or hydrogen, the energy services that are currently provided today by fossil fuels, but with small modular reactors instead. And, the big question is, well, that sounds great, but how do we do it? And how do we do it in a way that is commercially viable for those businesses. In other words, how do you actually supply small modular reactors to provide those energy services in a way that aligns with the procurement processes of those companies, that matches the cost and performance of the energy services provided by fossil fuels today, and essentially can be integrated into their business critical operations, with not only a minimum of disruption, because frankly that's not even enough. You need to be able to integrate these energy services into those operations in a way that ideally improves the economics and the performance of those operations, because any change in business obviously constitutes risk. And so to motivate any business to take that risk and actually take that leap to affect the change, it's got to be an irresistible investment opportunity. So, to achieve that outcome with the WEF, we've published a framework for accelerating the deployments of nuclear, and that's identified 9 critical sort of priority areas where coordinated action is needed, including looking at energy policies, modernizing regulation, building diverse competitive supply chains, and then, of course, catalyzing investment.
Yeah, there's plenty that we'll want to unpack as we go through there. Just to keep my focus on the UK for a second, and we'll zoom out more internationally in a second. The government here announced changes to the national policy statement, mostly aimed at reducing planning barriers for SMRs, but also other nuclear. How far does that get us towards your blueprint that you've been working on with the WEF? Is there more to do, or has that taken us a substantial way there?
It's a big step, and it's very welcome for sure. I mean, certainly facilitative actions by government that represent, no risk, low risk, or low resource, or even no resource actions, as the government has now started to make a lot more sites available, and to make the regulator available essentially for technology vendors to get through the licensing process, is fundamentally important for those technology vendors that are seeking to raise capital and bring investment into the UK. So why not, make those sites available? The UK has hundreds of existing brownfield, former retired or retiring thermal generation sites, whether they were previously nuclear sites or former coal plant sites, that could be repurposed for small modular reactor or other kinds of nuclear technology development, that many of these sites even have access to the grid, for example. So there's certainly more to be done, but making a large fleet of sites ready for development is the first important step, because today the pre-development barriers for any nuclear developer coming into the UK may represent as much as, hundreds of millions of dollars, or even, billions of dollars of pre-development work that needs to be done before that vendor even knows whether or not they actually have the permission to proceed with a project. We need to sort of figure out where the government can take action to begin to lower or eliminate those pre-development barriers and actually attract more investment and therefore more energy development, which is fundamentally important for the UK's growth and prosperity, obviously, as well.
Great. Alex, you might want to comment on that. I mean, it strikes me that you are actually quite well placed to draw the broader lessons for successful national infrastructure delivery. You obviously had some very senior roles in government, but you sit on the BT Group board with its own fibre rollout programme and at EDF with its large nuclear programme. Are there key lessons that we can distill for all infrastructure, or is everything super local and we have to look at the examples of, for example, Loudoun County in Virginia, USA for our lessons?
Well, local initiative can count, and I do think that the Virginia example is interesting there, and indeed there's a good Energy Unplugged podcast on that subject I listened to. And of course, community engagement and support is really, really important. But I think there are some bigger themes, and the two that I would really pick out, and you're right that BT and EDF have a big stake in this. I think the two companies between them this year are investing £10 billion in the UK. In the one case, obviously, in rolling out fibre infrastructure to people's homes and businesses, and in the other case, mainly spent on the building the new nuclear power to Hinkley. So incredible amounts of investment, and they do reflect, I think, two important general trends. The first is that policy consistency over time really matters. So, the plant that we're building at Hinkley is because of a contract that was struck in 2016, originally negotiated, I think, back in 2013. So we're going back some way now. And that will mean that users of electricity start paying for that when the plant comes on stream in 2030. So that's a very long-term construct. But it does mean that there is confidence, because that contract then is in place for the next 35 years, for the company who's made that big investment, that they'll be able to recover that over time. But that, I think, is policy consistency in the energy sector. And we've also seen that really well in telecoms, where I think around about 7 or 8 years ago, the government, the regulator, and BT sort of moved from their previous kind of standoff type situation to say, look, actually, we really need fibre to people's premises here in the UK. It's really important. Copper ain't going to do it. And we need to get on with it. We need to move fast on that. We've got to catch up. And ever since then, there has been, really good lineup on that. Huge amounts of investment in that build out, not just, I should say, by BT, but other companies too. It's been, we've moved from, I think, 3% of fibre to the home to over 65% today. So, really massive improvement just the last 5 years. And almost all of it private sector funded. A little bit of taxpayer funds have come in with some of the more remote areas where it hasn't been economic to do it. But that's been pretty good value for money. So I think if you get your policy framework in place, then the private sector will deliver. I think the other thing, just briefly to emphasize in both those cases, is really the importance of replication. So doing something over and over again. We know from any other kind of manufacturing sector that's the key to lowering costs, and that's true in this case as well. So the fact that at Hinkley, from reactor 1 to reactor 2, we've managed to get costs down between 20 and 30% for different elements there, just from applying learnings from the first build. If we carry on as we hope and expect to at Sizewell C, then we'll bring the costs down further. And Sizewell C will be an absolute carbon copy replica of the plant at Hinkley, and doing something again with the same design, the same firms, the same workers. That's the way to get big cost reductions. We've also seen that at BT's access provider is OpenReach, and the OpenReach teams basically have been doing this now, in many cases the same people. I was down with them a couple of days ago, who've been there for the last several years, building out the network, and they have got very, very, very good at doing it over and over again in all the different situations you find around people's homes. So that is actually, the cost per home has been falling, notwithstanding the inflationary environment. That's enabled us to go faster and faster. So we're passing over 1 million homes every quarter now.
Brilliant. If people do want to listen to that podcast, by the way, that Alex mentioned, it's Buddy Reiser, who was one of the main drivers behind the data center boom in one county, Virginia, Loudoun County. So that's on the Energy Unplugged stream. Really interesting answer there. There's also a really live and heated debate right now, Alex, in Australia about whether or not to launch their very first nuclear program. What advice would you give to a country like Australia that's never had a civil nuclear program, if they were deciding to develop the nuclear industry now? Perhaps some of the things you just mentioned, but would there be anything else as well?
Well, yes, a couple of things. First of all, public attitudes do matter. And we have found that in the UK, there's been more and more support for nuclear. And most people do now, correctly, I think, regard nuclear as safe. And also they're increasingly aware of the benefits of having their own source of power, as they've been particularly following the invasion of Ukraine. In a country who hasn't got into nuclear before, I think a big question in people's mind is always around what happens in the long term. So I think you need to make sure, as we have for Hinkley and will for Sizewell, that you have a funded program for decommissioning. So incredibly, that plant at Hinkley and Sizewell could be running into the 22nd century. 60 years is their design surface life, and most plants get an extension of 10 or 20 years. So you're thinking super long term. It really is unlike almost anything else you can think of. But at the end of that period, you need to know that there is a funded plan for decommissioning and for dealing with the long-term safe storage of the remaining waste from that. So that is part of the plan that we have in the UK, and I think is very relevant to any country who hasn't yet got into nuclear to understand how they're going to finish up with it.
Kirsty, you do a lot of international work. Anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, thanks. I have been working quite a bit with advising some of the Australian political leaders, and interestingly, the key point of interest is frequently the opportunity to repurpose coal plants. They have, very carbon intensive energy system in large parts of Australia right now, and a lot of coal plants that could easily be repurposed with small modular reactors to essentially co-locate a small modular reactor with an existing coal plant to create heat and steam, and then run that emissions-free, clean steam through the existing turbine at the coal plant, enabling the plant to continue operating using the existing grid infrastructure, and then, of course, importantly, retaining the jobs and the socioeconomic benefits associated with the operation of that plant, and maintaining the reliable supply of electricity as well to complement the renewables in the system. So that's been a very interesting sort of dimension, I think, for the Australian politicians exploring the opportunities for nuclear.
To just continue, if I could, on two other points. One is that if you're in Australia and thinking about nuclear today, I mean, there are 65 reactors under construction around the world. So there is now a really mature, proven, capable supply chain there, which is really important, and choice, which again is important if you're buying. The other thing I think, is the combination between nuclear and renewables, and the point I was making earlier about how there's growth and demand at both edges there. So in Australia, of course, they've got great solar resources. Very occasionally jealous of those at this time of year, we might be thinking. But the sun, doesn't shine all the time, and they too need to have their reliable base load, for that to be low carbon. And it's the combination between those two which is so powerful, which is why, not just for households, but again for industry, and obviously there's big industry in Australia, a lot of natural resources especially, they need to think about how they're going to be able to provide the energy for those really important industries employing lots and lots of people in Australia, and increasingly people will expect those to be low carbon too.
One other international example I was going to draw on, Alex, is actually looking at the way in which companies can do some of the heavy lifting on this, as much as governments and states. I mean, you're quite right about the public policy framework, of course. But I noticed in France that EDF are advertising 4 sites on their own land for data centers, ready equipped with their grid connections, 2 gigawatts of available power, basically trying to do as much of the heavy lifting as possible. Is that an important part of the model, or is this a couple of unique sites, but basically you need the government to do the work?
Two things about that. I think that you're right that governments always get involved in nuclear because it's super long term, because there's the safety and security issues. What we've seen, partly because of this terrific interest from the hyperscalers, and not just interest but commitments to pay for nuclear plants, is that now government can provide the frameworks, but a lot of the money can be coming from private sector investment, and indeed that's the model that the government has chosen for Sizewell C. And I know there's a lot of really strong interest in the private sector investment community in that. So government's always got a part to play, but doesn't need to do all of the roles. I think the other thing that's striking there is that for most companies who are not in the energy sector, they don't really want to become energy companies. It's quite specialized, and they want to be sophisticated users, but not to try and learn a whole new bunch of things. So I think that kind of almost turnkey type solution that EDF have been offering there in France is interesting, and is an offer. And we find we have very good quality discussions at EDF with big corporate users in the UK, from supermarkets, the government, the tech sector, who now do these power purchase agreements. But generally, they want us to do all the kind of the shaping of that power profile behind to make sure that they get the electricity that they need, and that is assured.
That's such an important point that we so often forget in the energy sector, that not everybody is as passionate about the details as perhaps we are. We're actually just launching a multi-client study in the UK, bringing together some tech companies and some energy companies. And one of the things we'll be trying to work on is actually what is that hierarchy of needs that data centers have, and where does energy fit into that? Because it's an important role doing that power sourcing, but as you say, it's not it's not the only thing you have to worry about if you're a tech company or indeed any large energy user. Kirsty, I wanted to come back to another aspect of and another geography, actually. So you've been thinking a lot about nuclear innovation, and that applies in a lot of different countries. I mentioned at the start that I'm spending quite a lot of my time supporting clients in India with the energy transition. And India itself has some very high aspirations of 100 gigawatts of nuclear by 2047, which is more than 10 times their current capacity and more than double the rate of expansion that we're seeing in China at the moment. So you might not be surprised, but I'm sure you'd disagree with us that at Aurora we're a little skeptical that that's achievable, at least with the current tools. However, you've just released a broader white paper, which you've called the 10 terawatts initiative, and that's aimed at looking at how nuclear innovation can drive OECD level energy access affordably and sustainably in middle-income, high-growth economies like India. Can you tell us what the key components necessary to achieve 10 terawatts, not just 100 gigawatts, would be in those non-OECD countries?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I mean, it does sound like an extraordinary ambition, absolutely, and especially given the sort of current context that we're in with conventional construction, and particularly, when we focus on the sort of outlier examples of first of a kind, first in a generation, Olympic scale construction that we're seeing in North America and Europe at the moment, which, represent a staggeringly large investment that's needed to stand up and, establish the nuclear industry again to be able to deliver those projects. And building out from what Alex was saying, that, a really important way to leverage that first of a kind investment is to, have an intentional program of build where you're sequencing from unit to unit and retaining the skills and capabilities that you're establishing through that construction, and of course repeating the same design over and over again. If you take that sort of principle of repeat build and fleet deployment, but move from sort of project traditional construction delivery into a high productivity manufacturing environment like a factory where you're actually making the reactors on a production line, so that they can be standardized products made in a factory, licensed and fueled in the factory, and then delivered to site pretty much as a completed finished unit. That looks much more similar to how we deliver most of our modern complex infrastructure. It used to take 18 months to make an airplane. Now it takes 9 days. If you look at the output of the automotive industry, for example, we're making 100 million cars per year. That's around about the energy equivalent of those engines is around 5 terawatts per year of car engines that the automotive industry is making every year. So when you look at the 10 terawatt initiative in the context of the industrial civilization's capability that we have today, actually it looks much more feasible and achievable. Now, India is a really interesting example because, of course, they have a large and growing coal fleet. They're extremely space constrained. So being able to repurpose those existing footprints of those existing thermal generation sites and use the existing transmission to maintain or even expand the supply of reliable energy, but without emissions, would be very attractive for a highly populated country like India. And particularly the opportunity to eliminate air pollution and so on from those coal plants is very interesting. And then, of course, India does have really a very impressive and growing manufacturing sector. So there's an opportunity there for India to play a really important role in the domestic supply chain of a manufactured reactor industry. We call it the heat box idea, essentially. So imagine if you're making 100 megawatt thermal heat boxes in a factory and then deploying them as standardized finished units to standardized sort of receiver sites, which could also be manufactured. That transforms the licensing process to mean that it's like license once, build many, instead of the current approach that we have today, which is slow and complicated and expensive and uncertain, represents a huge amount of investor risk, where you're essentially licensing each design each time for each site. That's appropriate for a construction model, but you can eliminate that through a manufacturing model. I'll give you one other quick example on the footprint idea for India. So we looked at one coal plant in India, the Anpara coal plant, which is a 2.6 megawatt coal plant. And if you wanted to replace the output of that coal plant with solar and batteries, and when I say replace the output, I don't just mean 2.6 gigawatts of solar. I mean actually generating the 90% capacity factor, 2.6 gigawatts that the coal plant is currently generating. That solar plant would be 380 square kilometers and would cost about $20 billion because and that's assuming very low cost per unit PV, like less than $1 per watt. But because the solar farm would be so large and the battery and the storage required would be so large to meet that 90% capacity of that generation throughout the year, you start to realize that even though solar is cheap on a per unit basis, if you actually wanted to replace the energy generation that society needs, you would have to build so much of it that you start looking at a footprint which, 380 square kilometers, that's sort of 30 kilometers on a side, right? So imagine how long it would take you to walk one side of that square. So for India, I think the opportunity for a very small footprint, emissions-free and reliable high capacity factor energy source like nuclear is incredibly compelling. We just have to really transform the delivery model, and that means transforming the way that we design and deliver and license those products. And so that's what the Heatbox idea is all about. And I think India is a fantastic market to mobilize the supply chain there.
Yeah, so interesting. I mean, India is building plenty of those in absolutely enormous solar parks in the sort of Rajasthan desert. But I mean, you're right, it needs all of the above, frankly, because not only is it trying to decarbonize, but it's actually growing quite rapidly, both in population and GDP terms. So actually keeping up with those demands is huge. So fascinating to hear that new thinking about how nuclear can play a bigger and bigger role. We talked about how we might accelerate deployment and some of the really positive cases and innovations. We also talked about the size of the opportunity. We should turn to some of the barriers that have got in the way of nuclear deploying in the past. I mean, I think many people, certainly in UK and North America, would see the attractiveness of nuclear once deployed, but sometimes cost or skills and supply chain are the barrier to getting there. Kirsty, let's stay with you for a minute. I know Terra Praxis have been looking not just at how nuclear can help, as we were talking about earlier on, with that sort of technology, those generative AI and data centers, but also how you can use generative AI to streamline new nuclear development. Can you say a bit more about the potential you see here?
Yeah, well, we've been working really closely with Microsoft, who Microsoft is really interested in this repurposing coal plants idea in particular for, generating abundant clean power for their own business critical operations, but also for their customers' business critical operations. And therefore, through that partnership, we've been focused on one of the big barriers that we see for large-scale nuclear deployment, which is the licensing process, which today represents a significant barrier in terms of cost, complexity, uncertainty, as I was saying a moment ago. So the generative AI for licensing tool that we've developed with Microsoft is essentially, as you're saying, leveraging the power of AI to generate license applications. And if you look at early site permits, for example, which is an early site permit is essentially licensing a site for nuclear development. The Department of Energy identified the potential for 170 gigawatts of new nuclear at 145 retiring or retired coal plant sites in the United States, which is amazing. That's a very significant deployment potentially of nuclear energy. How do you operationalize that? Well, the first thing you might want to do is generate an early site permit for those sites. Today, it would cost about $30 to $40 million and take years of work and armies of people, both in terms of the applicant and the regulator side, to generate an early site permit for a single site. Leveraging the generative AI for licensing tool, you could potentially generate early site permit applications for all 145 sites for a fraction of the cost and in a fraction of the time. And interestingly, because the generative AI tool will check relentlessly for quality and compliance, you actually may end up being able to generate a higher quality application than, the old human way. Now, of course, this doesn't mean humans won't have a role, they will, but the human contribution will be in the real value added elements. But it does unlock potentially one of those big pre-development barriers that we were talking about earlier, potentially making hundreds of sites ready for nuclear development.
That's super interesting. I'm not sure Gen AI can solve the financing challenge yet, but Alex, perhaps I'll ask you about that. Are there any prospects of, genuine private sector financing of nuclear, either at the large or small modular reactor level, or is it ultimately always going to have to be underwritten by public sector balance sheets and therefore limited by the amount that states can borrow?
I think the situation in the UK has really changed. Back in 2016, we were looking at what was going to be first of a kind for Hinkley, and government then, and I was working there at the time, thought that was likely to be expensive and risky and could take a long time because we hadn't built a nuclear plant in the UK for over a generation. We just didn't have the firms, the know-how, the workers to do that. So for that reason, we wanted to get strategic investors, and we wanted to make sure that consumers wouldn't be paying until the electricity came on. So I think that was very appropriate. Got no regrets about that from that time. But I think we're now in a very different situation because second of a kind, and indeed future ones as well, if we go again, then you are literally just using the same people and the same firms and the same components and the same technology, same design at a different site. And that is actually going to make it much easier to lower the costs and make it much more predictable and shorten the timescales. And that's not just from a production point of view, it's also from the regulatory perspective. All the approvals that are applied to Hinkley will be applied as well to Sizewell, which is a replica plant. We don't need to reinvent that. So I think that is really the key to it. And that's meant from a financing point of view, the government has, I think, rightly chosen to say, look, we can use this regulated asset-based model to see what kind of level of capital and at what cost we can raise in the private sector. And from all I hear, obviously it's a government-led initiative, and we're just a co-investor, but they've been getting a really good reception for that. And I think that is really going to be a game changer in the UK to get private sector investment coming into new nuclear build in the UK, confident that they can do that and still get a good return. And this is money that's coming from pension companies and things like that, where they're very interested in super long-term cash flows to be able to meet their obligations, and where there is a small amount of risk that obviously is retained by the government, and there's some risk in the bill which comes with consumers, but overall that risk is much lower and is much more sustainable for the project, and that means that it can be built at lower cost.
Really interesting. So actually you're linking, I was going to ask you about skills and supply chain. You're linking the maturity of those skills and supply chain to the financeability, which is a really interesting point. What lessons do we need to bear in mind from the past in how we retain and enhance those skills and those supply chains?
Yeah, so on the supply chains, we really want to use pretty much the same ones. Obviously, there is a competitive process, and Sizewell are going through that. But most of the winning bids tend to be from people who did it before, say, I now know exactly how to do this, and I'd like to do it again. The second factor has been that a lot of the work at Hinkley has been done on site. Of course, it's a small site, it's a congested site, and there's particular requirements for working a site of that kind. Over time, we've been able to get more and more of that to be built off-site, prefab and installed in actually on the site much more rapidly. And at Sizewell, we'll be able to do much more of that. And so the amount of it, which is, if you like, manufactured to a sort of factory standard rather than just assembled on site, is greatly increased. And that again makes it much more predictable. We've also been able to we were still working on the design. EDF was still working on the design of Hinkley in the early phases, still going through regulatory approvals for some of the detailed designs. That's not true for Sizewell now. So we can now procure at Sizewell for all the things in the optimal order. We know which factory you want to make which part and which year, and that is make something which you've got nearly 4,000 firms involved producing hundreds of thousands of components. So you do need to have again an ideal logical sequence for that, and we will be able to apply that at Sizewell. So I really think that whole supply chain management is critical to the financeability and managing the total costs of it. On the skills side, I mean, basically we've had to kind of rebuild the skills base in the UK, and that's not, obviously you might say it's a construction site, we've got lots of people who do civil engineering projects, but some of the particular things we've had to construct have been very nuclear specialist. The very incredibly high standards needed for nuclear because of its very long operation life, and some specialist components as well. So that has meant that we've had to effectively retrain tens of thousands of people in the UK in nuclear skills. Is great now. It's been a real nuclear renaissance. It's fantastic. And if you've been down to the site recently, you meet all the apprentices there, all the people who've come into the industry. A lot of people as well now also switching from other sectors into nuclear, because nuclear as a whole has got a demand for 40,000 jobs between now and 2030. So there's a huge program being run by the industry with government support as well, called Destination Nuclear, to attract more people into industry. We've got those people. That's the renaissance. Now we need to make sure that they're kept busy, not just at Hinkley, but then at Sizewell, and as you say, also for SMRs and for AMRs in future. And I find it really inspiring that we've got this great capability now, this fantastic know-how. And I come from Bristol, and outside Bristol now, I'm very proud to say that there's at Aztec West, just outside the city now, our engineering services hub there. So I've got 950 people working there. I mean, it's an incredible resource, not just for EDF, but for the whole country to have that amount of nuclear know-how.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So actually, we've talked about a few of the things that have been barriers in the past: the manufacturing, the supply chain, the skills, the financeability. The other one I think you both alluded to, so perhaps I'll give you both the opportunity to comment on this, starting with Kirsty, is maintaining public support. And I think it's fair to say, I mean, that's been very variable by country. So that presumably there are lessons for how this is better or worse done. Where would you see the best examples of maintaining public support, and what should we bear in mind if we want to extend the amount of nuclear that we're building in any country?
I think public support, has never been higher in living memory, and it's really sort of looping us back to where Alex started with what's driving the sort of demand for nuclear, which is increasing awareness that we're not making enough progress on our decarbonisation goals, energy security concerns, especially obviously in Europe in light of the invasion of Ukraine, and the cost of living, and the recognition really that that we do need nuclear energy in the mix, and that nuclear energy brings very important attributes that are just not provided by any other kinds of technologies. That recognition of the benefits of nuclear is driving a sort of a new perspective on the perceived risks. And that's a sort of fundamental piece of risk communication. We do all kinds of risky things in our lives. We drive around in cars, and we fly in airplanes, we drink alcohol, and we do those risky behaviors because we think that the benefits outweigh the risks, and also because those activities are quite normalized in our society. And nuclear energy, I think, is beginning to really, benefit from that sort of normalizing in the discourse and recognition of the benefits, and that's helped by important demand signals from big companies, like the Microsofts of this world, that announced that they were going to be restarting 3 Mile Island and experienced almost no backlash whatsoever. So it's partly to do with the sort of the messenger as well as the message, and it's also partly, I think, to do with the sort of the moment that we're in with regards to the commercialization of the advanced technologies. And I think the other sort of perceptions that we need to really pay attention to here are the perceptions of the financial sector, and really sort of designing for the requirements of mainstream finance. We saw that very successful example from the wind and solar industry, which started off in a way quite similarly to nuclear: expensive, bespoke, vertically integrated. And as the solar and wind sectors became more commodified, and the supply chains became more diverse, and costs therefore came down, that enabled project developers to start developing commercially financed projects with real confidence around budget and schedule for the delivery of those commodified equipment and materials. And I think that ultimately is the direction that nuclear energy needs to go in to achieve the sort of the cost outcomes and the rates of deployment and the high quality, certainty that will enable private finance, but also then build public confidence that this technology represents really good value for their homes and businesses.
Great. Alex, anything you want to add to that?
Really, several things that Kirsty has just said, just to maybe a couple of things, just to, Dan and Kirsty as well, but we do have a very robust independent system of regulation in the UK for nuclear safety, and the work of the Office for Nuclear Regulation is, admired the world over. So that is very important. It's the public a right to feel that is held to a very high standard. I would just add to that since joining EDF last summer, I've been enormously impressed by the culture of people who work in the company and indeed in the whole industry. It really is a kind of a safety first culture. Every meeting we have starts with a safety statement. It's kind of like really works for people who've worked in power stations for many years of their lives. They're very proud of that. If you go up to Heysham, where I was recently, one of our older plants there, Heysham 1 and Heysham 2, there's 2 nuclear reactors there, the old AGR design. Enormous support within the local community. All the people I met there, they're really proud of what they've got. In fact, their only concern is what their future holds after Heysham 1 and 2 finish up, and there'll be new nuclear plants built there, which is they're hoping there will be. So I think that sense in which the people working in the industry are some of the most responsible and conscientious people that you could possibly find in our society should give people confidence in nuclear. And as Kirsty was saying, we do need to think that the whole economy depends on energy for its operation, and every household, every person in their life needs energy. So we need energy that is our own energy, that we can rely on, that is plentiful, that is safe, and which is being produced at the lowest possible cost to the climate, and that is nuclear power.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both for that discussion. I hope listeners will agree that we've covered a huge amount of ground across technologies, innovations, between countries, learning from past experience and thinking about some of the ways we might do things better in the future. So all that remains for me is to thank our guests, Kirsty Gogan and Sir Alex Chisholm. Kirsty, Alex, thank you both very much for joining me on Energy Unplugged.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
That was Dan Monzani, Aurora's Managing Director for UK, Ireland and India, talking to Kirsty Gogan, the founder and managing partner of Terra Praxis and also managing partner of LucidCatalyst, and Sir Alex Chisholm, Chair of EDF Energy. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow or subscribe to the podcast via whatever platform you use.